Hola! This new shocking inflation data proves that this time around it is not transitory. In step number one, we look at the global financial crisis, the GFC, versus what we saw in the downturn in 2020. I want to point out that when I'm talking about inflation, I'm talking specifically about the consumer price inflation, not necessarily asset inflation or the dollar going down in value against other currencies. I'm just talking about the stuff you buy on a daily basis. For more details, go to George Gann. Hola, from Colombia. With the present great world confusion, I wish to do my part to accelerate the evolution of human consciousness. Please help by subscribing and sharing these videos. Thank you. So let's look at the stock market and the housing market. The stock market went down by about 50% during the global financial crisis. The housing market went down by a similar percentage, but the housing market took a lot longer to go from peak to trough. During the global financial crisis, the delinquencies of mortgage payment, that is how many homeowners were delinquent on their mortgage payments, was about 9%. During 2020, it got to 8%. Some of the more specific loans, like the FHA loans, went much higher on the delinquency level in 2020 than they were during the depth of the GFC. Now, let's look at the unemployment rate. During the GFC, the unemployment got up to 10%. In 2020, if you believe the official numbers, it got to 15%. These are the U3 numbers, which are the headline numbers you see on CNBC and Bloomberg. These numbers are completely and totally bogus, but at least we are comparing bogus numbers to bogus numbers. Now, let's look at what did the GDP, gross domestic product, do. During the GFC, it went down 6.25%, and it went down 10.5% in 2020. Moving over to this chart, we are looking at real GDP, nominal GDP adjusted for inflation. Between 2000 and 2002, it goes down slightly. This was the recession of the dot-com bust. In 2002, it starts to go back up to around 16 trillion in 2008. It crashes about 6% during the global financial crisis and goes back up, but with a slightly lower trend line than the one prior to GFC. This is an indication that the system itself was broken. In 2008-2009, that is when we started to get quantitative easing. QE1, QE2, QE3, which now has turned into a QE infinity. In 2020, we are up near $19 trillion in real GDP, but it came crashing down by 10.5%. That is when the government came out with guns blazing. The budget deficit was 1.4 trillion in 2008, and during 2020, the government deficit went over $4.2 trillion. In the next step, we see that the GDP technically recovered and got back to a point close to where it was in 2019. Where would GDP be today if the government did not do the 4.2 trillion deficit spending? Instead of being down 10.5%, it would be down at least 20%. If GDP was down and stayed down by 20%, what would that do to the mortgage delinquency rate? Instead of 8%, it would probably be far, far higher. The unemployment rate would probably be close to the 25% reached during the Great Depression. Let's not forget the housing market and the stock market. If they went down 50% during the global financial crisis, with delinquency of 9% and unemployment of 10%, what would the housing and stock market do if we did not have the crazy government spending and the delinquency went up to 50%, 15%, and the unemployment went up to 25%? Most likely, the housing and markets would be down 60, 70, even 75%. Further, we have to consider the fact that our current economy is wildly distorted, extremely unhealthy, and structurally unsound. I use the hot air balloon example to illustrate the point. The real economy would be the hot air balloon. The financial economy would be the basket. So, where the economy goes, the financial economy goes with it. Makes sense, right? However, now we have a completely distorted financial economy, where the financial economy is the hot air balloon and the real economy is the basket. So, wherever the financial economy goes, in other words, wherever asset prices go, such as stocks and housing, that's where the real economy is going to go as well. If stocks and housing go down by 50, 60, or 75%, what would that do to the US economy today in 2021? Most people still believe that the government will fix everything. But I say this: people think that the downturn or depression in the economy in 2020, with the GDP going down by 20%, was a result of the cerveza sickness. And no one could have predicted that we would have the cerveza sickness, right? In fact, it was not the cerveza sickness that caused the downturn. It was the government response to it. Even more importantly was what the central planners had done. From 2008 to 2020, I'm referring to the intervention from government and the central banks, which created massive economic distortions. What we have is debt levels at an all-time high: the consumer debt, corporate debt, and sovereign debt. This creates an environment of extreme malinvestment and misallocation of resources. The seeds were sown back in 2008. The cerveza sickness was just a straw that broke the camel's back. If you don't believe me, look at what happened back with the Spanish flu. The GDP went down 0% during the Spanish flu. Therefore, what we saw in 2020 was not a result of the cerveza sickness. It was just a catalyst that exposed how structural unsound the system was in general. It exposed all of the distortions that were a result of government and Fed intervention to save the economy during the GFC. Further, the distortions created from 2020 to 2021 are far greater than the distortions created from 2008 to 2020. Step number 2. The dependence we now have on money printing. The official explanation of the crazy money creation is that it is just temporary fiscal deficits to avoid permanent economic and social damage from the cerveza sickness. With the government spending, we saw the M2 money supply skyrocket in 2020. The government deficit spending went through the roof, and so did the Fed's balance sheet. So, why does this money printing need to continue indefinitely into the future? When you build the entire economy around government central bank intervention, you can never stop the intervention, or else the entire economy collapses. This is very similar to what we saw in Venezuela. Here we have Hugo Shavez. When he took over the economy, it was a market driven, but it revolved around the production of goods and services. Very similar in what we would see in Colombia today. I can personally confirm this since I have lived in Popayán, Colombia for 4.5 years now. When Chavez took over, he nationalized the oil and basically paid people to stay at home and do nothing. When you build the entire economy around oil, the economy gets addicted to oil being at a certain price. So when oil goes from, let's say, $100 a barrel down to $30 a barrel, that presents a huge problem for the economy because it is so dependent around this one thing, which was oil. If the economy would have been more diversified, it would have withstood the drop in the oil price. Think back at what happened in the US in 2014, 2015. When the price of oil went down below $30 a barrel, how did that affect your economy? Nowhere near to the degree that it affected Venezuela. So what happened in Colombia when the price of oil dropped down to $30 a barrel? Was there massive hyperinflation? No, because they had a more diversified economy that was not built and completely dependent on oil. Looking here at two non-economic examples. It is the same thing as someone taking steroids. When that individual stops taking the steroids, their level of testosterone basically go down to zero. Why? Because the body gets addicted and becomes dependent on the steroids to produce the testosterone, which it would normally produce at a healthy, steady, natural level. Take away the steroids, no more testosterone production. Same thing with heroin guy. When he is on the heroin, he may not be too coherent, but at least he is functional. Take away the heroin, and he either passes out or dies. Why? Because his body became acclimated, became dependent on the heroin. Just like the monetary heroin our economy is dependent on today. We will continue to spend on stimmy checks and infrastructure, trillions and trillions, more and more into the future, as well as Social Security, welfare, Medicare, all of the transfer payments that are going from the government to the private sector. The pushback from the Keynesian economists is that our debt to GDP ratio was very similar during World War II. And we got that down to a level that was far more manageable. Let's look at this chart. It starts in 1940 and goes to 2020 of the federal government's deficit as a percentage of GDP. It starts at 0, goes all the way down to 30%, and above to 5%. During World War II, the deficit was 29%, almost 30%. During the cerveza sickness, it went down to 19%. The argument is that just like in World War II, these deficits will get a lot less. In fact, we may even run a surplus because the deficit spending is only temporary. However, what they're not admitting to is that the deficit that we have today is much, much different than the deficit we had during World War II. Why? Because the present costs are recurring. The World War II costs were just a one-time spending. Today's debt is far more dangerous and permanent. Therefore, this government deficit spending is propping up the entire economy, and this deficit spending will have to continue into the future. It is something that will become permanent, just like quantitative easing. When we started with QE1, it was called QE, not QE1, because there was not supposed to be a QE2, QE3, and now QE infinity. It will be the exact same thing with government deficit spending and money printing. Due to my peaceful non-cooperation, I went to prison. I described my prison experience in my book, True Freedom is Inside of Me. Please visit my bilingual website. The only solution is very simple. I must connect to my true self, my soul. Easy to say, not so easy to do. Please go into action now and make the choice between listening to your ego-mendacious mind and the external authorities or listening to your soul, the internal authority. I consult and offer tools so that you can find your individual solution by making contact with your soul. Your soul will then effectively guide you through the upcoming, long-lasting, turbulent transition. Infinite love.